So William Morales in the chat asked, how does the rabbi decide who gets counted in a minyan in an Orthodox congregation? That's an interesting question. It depends. Nowadays, the typical understanding is to basically count anyone who has a Jewish mother in a minyan, but that is for sure not the attitude of our sages. Now, whenever I use the word sage, and I would say most academics, most rabbis, when they use the word sage, they mean Amoraim and Tanaim, or Amoraim and before, not rabbis post the closing of the Gemara. So they for sure would not have counted someone who publicly breaks Shabbat in a minyan, or even privately breaks Shabbat in a minyan. I think the Vilna Gaon came up with the whole notion that if he breaks Shabbat lefarhesia, that means publicly, blatantly, without any shame, then you can't count him. But if he does it shamefully, in other words, if he parks 2 blocks down and he sort of sneaks into shul, one could be lenient because it shows that perhaps he doesn't want to drive. Perhaps that's his only way to get there. There's many rebbeim. I think Rabbi Cohen, there's a famous posuk out of Brooklyn. And I mean, it's pretty much how people talk nowadays. Even Chabad, they almost tolerate Jews driving to shul on Shabbat. Most Chabad houses, like they wouldn't have a minyan if people didn't drive. It's funny. What really separated the conservative movement from Orthodoxy was their ruling, I believe it was in 1956, to allow people to drive on the Sabbath. The real ruling was that they should only drive if they have no other way to get to shul. And the initial ruling was that they were only allowed to drive to the closest shul near them. But that today has been completely tossed out the window. People driving conservative shuls like they driving to reform shuls. But the position of Orthodoxy nowadays is to tolerate people driving to shul, but not to encourage it. They just don't say anything. And ideally, I would say rabbis who are more involved, once they found out somebody actually drove there, they'll offer to put the person up either in their house or in the neighborhood so they won't have to drive on Shabbos. In terms of who do you count in a minyan, it's funny. This is something I wanted to make a video on, and it's a little groundbreaking. The Talmud does not say that you could only count men in a minyan, and you guys could look it up. The Rambam does not say that you could only count men in a minyan. The first, to my knowledge, the first source that ever mentioned the idea that you cannot count women in a minyan was the Shulchan Aruch. Now, we're talking about a work of the 15th century. One could assume that the reason the Rambam or our sages in the Talmud and the Gemara didn't say anything was because the women never went to shul. One could view it like that.
Could it be that it was just understood? And it later became a problem? Or
for it to be halakha, it has to be mentioned. There are so many trivial ideas that are mentioned in halakha that we would assume are also understood, but they're still mentioned.
If it's in the Shulchan Aruch, what's the source?
There's a lot of things in the Shulchan Aruch that don't have a Mishnaic source. In other words, there are many things that are just minhagim, that this is just the way we do it. Right?
Isn't excuse me for interrupting, but isn't prayer that requires minyan a sort of a replacement of the sacrifices? And we know that the sacrifices were done by the Kohanim, and you couldn't have Kohanim women do it. You had to have Kohanim men do it.
Not that the prayers are a replacement for the sacrifices, but the times of prayers coincide with sacrifices, with the exception of Marv, where there was no sacrifices done at nighttime. But the morning sacrifice was called shacharit, and the afternoon sacrifice was called mincha. But it was prayer for everybody. It wasn't just for the priest. Even during the time of the Second Temple, when sacrifices were being offered, they still had prayer. They still had the Amidah. So it wasn't really done in lieu. For the bigger question is, when were these prayers developed? Now, with the Amidah, the 18, I guess now is really 19 benedictions, comes back to the time of Ezra. I mean, there's a big debate on whether prayer is a Torah command or if it's a rabbinic obligation, right? I mean, the Rambam, Maimonides, believes that prayer is a service of the heart to God and it's a Torah obligation. And the Ramban, Nachmanides, says it's rabbinic. Regardless, now that we have an obligation to pray, because whether it's rabbinic or it's from the Torah commands us to listen to what the court establishes. But prayer, whenever halakha mentions the phrase prayer, tefillah, it's only referring to the Amidah. But there's a lot of things that people say in the liturgy nowadays that has really nothing to do with the Amidah, but they just added poems, Aleinu, Pesukah de Zimra, which, things that people think are obligatory. Our sages didn't really pray them. But the whole Seder of Korbanos, that many people skip, but there's a lot of people who wake up early just to say them. But the answer to that question, to the initial question, is that from what I see, there's no real Mishnaic source to exclude women from a minyan.